Hi, I'm Rob Woods, and I'm going to describe a complex adaptive system and its adaptations over time. The system I'm going to tell you about is the Newcastle Rail Corridor. There are many examples of complex adaptive systems, many of which have been shared in our Week 2 discussions. So, let's recap first. How can we define a complex adaptive system? It's not just the number of parts in a system that makes it complex. Harris defines an environmental system as being temporally and spatially extensive, non-homogeneous, non-linear, populated by people and other evolved species. When defining a system as a complex whole, the functioning of which depends on its parts and interaction between those parts. To illustrate the characteristics of a complex adaptive system and its adaptations, we are going to look at the wicked problem that the city of Newcastle has faced recently. I've already mentioned it in the Week 2 discussions, but this is an issue that provides an interesting opportunity to examine complex adaptive systems. The cessation of passenger services between Newcastle and Wickham stations occurred in December 2014. The subsequent removal of the heavy rail line in the Newcastle CBD occurred in December 2015. Some of you might ask why this is such a complex issue. Please allow me to explain. Our first stop in looking at this issue is looking at the number of stakeholders. There are many stakeholders, but to simplify things, they've been grouped together. We have the government, both state and local. The next grouping is the developers, including Urban Growth New South Wales, and the former Lord Mayor, Jeff McCloy. The final group is the locals and visitors. This group includes residents, businesses, workers, and vulnerable groups. The vulnerable grouping includes the elderly, homeless, and the disabled. Each group is dependent in some way on the others. It's this group that faces the result of the decisions made by the first two groups. We'll look at this in more detail. The stakeholder groups around the NRC have interactions that rely on both input and feedback from each other. This is an area where a problem has arisen. There seems to be a great disparity between the stakeholder groups. The interactions between the groups seem to have broken down due to a lack of community consultation. Locals and visitors have been denied the opportunity to provide feedback on this issue. They are the group that will end up using the redeveloped rail corridor and would most likely have valid suggestions for its use. Within the locals and visitors grouping, there are many different groups, all with different needs. We find residents, business owners, workers, and the tourists that visit Newcastle. Have all the groups been considered? There is one subgroup that has been particularly let down. I'd like to pause here to explain a little bit more about vulnerable groups. These are groups such as the elderly, homeless, or disabled. A vulnerable group has been defined as a group with the diminished ability of a group of individuals to cope with, resist, or recover from the impact of an event. In this event, vulnerable groups have been affected by the decision of the state government. The vulnerable groups don't always have the means to find out about changes. The government and the developers hold the power. The developers see the financial value in the land and make donations to the government, who then enable the developers to get the land to build their next venture, which may not be the most sustainable use of the environment. The different stakeholder groups value the NRC environment in different ways, and within this system, careful management is needed to bring about sustainable use. In this case, all stakeholder groups should have been brought together to share their vision in a collaborative way. This would have required working across a number of government groups. Unfortunately, this case has resulted in a poor distribution of power, which has enabled the spectre of corruption to damage the community's perception of the government and developers. It has led to the resignation of the Lord Mayor and a state MP when donations were revealed. There are many examples of interactions within the NRC system. At a basic level, you have the locals, travellers, interacting with the corridor to get somewhere. There is anecdotal evidence of the homeless using the closed rail stations for shelter. Another interaction that we have is the developer government, where money changes hands. The NRC has many interactions, both large and small in consequence. This constant dynamism of a CAS is typical. They follow a cycle, which we'll explore in more detail through our questions, called the adaptive cycle. The adaptive cycle has 4 stages. We'll now look at these. The first stage is one of rapid growth. Walker and Salt tell us that the rapid growth phase is one dominated by pioneers or species that seize the first opportunities. Weeds always sprout up first on a cleared land. We could also see them as innovators in the economic world. Our reading for the week uses Google as a good example. The conservation stage sees a gradual change from growth to one of accumulation of energy or resources. Relationships are strengthened, efficiency increases. The resources that grow within the system become tied up and hard to access, as in the money tied up in building and machines in a large company. Some miners in the Hunter Valley have suffered from this during the downturn. The release phase can happen in an instant, for example, a bushfire breaking out during the summer. If the disturbance is large enough to break down connections in the system, resources are released, as in capital or nutrients. The drop in the spot price sent the coal industry in the Hunter Valley into a free fall that has only slowed in recent months. The reorganization phase occurs after the chaos of the release phase and allows for reinvention and new opportunities. New species can make their way into an environment damaged by fire. In my case, a forced redundancy from geology has presented me with a new opportunity to learn. Let's explore together how these stages might have occurred in the Newcastle Rail Corridor through our questions this week. The heavy rail line in Newcastle has had a long history. I would suggest that the whole adaptive cycle would have happened at least once.